بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Today I would like to discuss a particular line from Ziyarat Warith where we are told from the Holy Imam, Assalamu alayka ya waritha Musa kalimillah. So I want to discuss generally what this means and a little bit more specifically. First of all of the Aimma alayhim salatu wassalam are inheritors of the various sifat of the Anbiya, in the sense that they inherit the spiritual charisma, the spiritual legacy, and the knowledge of all of the prophets. And we have examples from the time of the Imams themselves, where, for example, Imam Hussain alayhi salam would teach Nabi Allah Khidr. We have traditions in the early texts where Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam said that if I was the third one with Musa and Khidr, I would have explained the whole situation, and I would have basically settled the entire situation if I was the third one present with them. So this is a very clear indication in the traditions that all of the Imams, peace and blessings be upon them, are inheritors of the prophets, of their knowledge and their spiritual legacy and spiritual charisma. As for Nabi Allah Musa alayhi salam being Kalimullah, or in this case Kalimullah, what does this mean? Specifically, what it means is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke to Musa. The word Kalim literally means the one that is spoken to, right? And of course this refers to the first encounter between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Musa in Surah Taha, as it is accounted and told to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Taha, where first of all Moses sees a burning bush and he says, Anastu naran, right? That is, it is as if I see, or not as if, he's saying that I see a fire, right? And he goes towards that fire, he climbs up the mountain, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Idha nudiya ya Musa. And Musa is called upon by Allah when Moses is called upon, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala introduces himself for the first time to Moses by saying, Inni ana rabbuka fakhla na'alayk, that verily I am your Lord, remove your sandals, for you have entered the holy valley of Tawa. And this is the first time where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala introduces himself to Moses, and thus he's known as Kalimullah. It's the one that is spoken to by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And naturally, of course, we don't believe Allah has a voice. This is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created so that Moses could receive revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah does not literally have a voice. It is not reflective of the that or the essence of Allah, but rather, as the Mufassirun tell us, it is khariqul adat. It is something that is an exception to natural laws, something that is exceptional and miraculous, or it's a mu'jiza. Okay. Now the second question that I would like to address is, what was Musa's mission and what were his struggles? Very simply put, Musa's mission was to deliver the people of Israel, or Bani Israel, the children of Israel, out of Egypt, in what is known as the Exodus in the Bible. And I will return more to this in relation to Imam Hussain alayhi salam. But basically, Nabi Allah Musa alayhi salam was a deliverer for the people of Israel. He was to deliver them to the promised land. He was to deliver them out of the shackles of torture and oppression that they were experiencing under the Pharaoh. Now, how is the role of Musa alayhi salam connected with Imam al-Hussein, and in what ways does Imam al-Hussein inherit Prophet Musa? I would like to answer both of these questions together. First of all, I could certainly say, as I said in the beginning, that Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam inherited whatever knowledge Musa had alayhi salatu wasalam. Imam al-Hussein inherited Musa's ma'rifah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that whatever knowledge Nabi Allah Musa had of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Imam al-Hussein certainly inherited that, or according to some traditions, his knowledge was superior to even Moses himself. That is, his cognizance and awareness and spiritual awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in that sense, in a most direct and immediate way, he is a successor to Musa alayhi salam. However, to be a little bit more specific in this regards, as I mentioned, or rather I did not mention before, but I'll mention it now, both of them fought against the tyrants of their time. This is a very, very important point which cannot go unnoticed. Both of them fought institutions of tughyan. Tughyan is essentially an institution which is brimming and filled with arrogance, or it's an institution and the people of that institution, or the leader of that institution, is the one who thinks of himself, an ra'ahu istaghna, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, that he sees himself, or it could be she's herself as well, it's possible, as being independent of Allah, that they don't need Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's blessings, they don't need Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy, that essentially they think of themselves as God. They have one of the most profound and disturbing God complex. And of course this is a similar attribute between the Pharaoh and Yazid, or ala Fir'aun wa Banu Umayyah, right? That the people of Fir'aun and Banu Umayyah had these attributes, had these shared attributes between one another. And on one side you have Nabi Musa and Bani Israel, on the other hand you have the Ahlul Bayt and their followers among Bani Hashim and the Shia who are struggling against Banu Umayyah during their time, and after, of course, Banu Abbas. Both of these leaders had exceeded all limits. Both of them maimed, killed, and tortured people with impunity. That is, that they thought that they could violate all laws of humanity without any judgment upon them, without them worrying about being held to account for these actions. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to this in the Holy Quran, in Surah Ibrahim, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا مُوسَى بِآيَاتِنَا أَنْ أَخْرَجْ قَوْمَكَ مِنَ الظُّلِمَاتِ إِلَى النُّورِ. That we sent Moses with our signs to take his people out of the dhulimat, from the depths of darkness, and to put them into the light. And Moses was to remind them, وَذَكِّرْهُمْ بِآيَامِ اللَّهِ, and he was to remind them of the days of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَإِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِكُلِّ صَبَارٍ شُكُورٍ. And in that are signs for every person that has an abundant amount of patience and is thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I would like to first discuss this verse and then move on to the next verse in Surah Ibrahim in order to compare both of these sacred personalities. First of all, Tabrasi in Majma' al-Bayan tells us that Ayam Allah here can mean many things. One of them, according to Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, is that it means the ni'mah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Moses came to his people to deliver them into spiritual prosperity. That before he came to them, they found themselves in the depths of darkness, in the darkness of kufr and disbelief. It was the job of Moses and the divine mandate of Moses to bring them into the light of Iman and to remind them of God's blessings, right? And after reminding them of God's blessings, they shall of course be patient and thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Naturally, this is the objective of every prophet. Now, another meaning of Ayamillah, and I'm going to get to explain why I'm emphasizing upon this, is the wahdaniyya and the sultan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the oneness and the power of Allah. That the goal of the prophets are to demonstrate that God is present, or to demonstrate that God is all-powerful and He has complete dominion over His creation.
You're making really good points.
Yeah.
It's just when you're closing it, you're going to the paper.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I won't do that. Okay.
Time between you going
Okay.
and say both.
Okay.
We catch that sound.
Okay.
So we don't have to clip it or anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect.
But it's beautiful.
Okay.
You can take your time. You can pause.
Okay.
Yeah. There's no problem.
So I'll go back to Ayamillah, and then you guys can cut in and stuff,
no,
right?
sure.
Okay.
No.
So what are the ayam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Musa is commanded by Allah to remind the people of Israel of? Well, first of all, it is the blessings of Allah, it is the power of Allah, and the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It of course has many, many meanings. But essentially it is the remembrance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with the believers throughout history. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is never absent. He is always watching, He is always with the believers, and His blessings are always with the believers. Now, how can any of this be related to Imam Hussain alayhi salatu wasalam? Well, first of all, Imam Hussain, peace and blessings be upon him, was the embodiment of the nur of Allah. That he was the existential exemplification of the light of Allah, the guidance of Allah. And however, in this case, he did not have to bring his companions out of the darkness into the light. Rather, his companions were already in the light. The only companion who we could say perhaps who came into that light would have been Hur. Otherwise, the other companions did not need to be taken out of the depths of kufr into Iman. They already had Iman. And Abu Abdullah alayhi salam was the exemplification of the nur of Allah, of the light of guidance, of the light of mercy, of the light of the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, in this regard, the Imam, similar to the Prophet, is muftarad al-ta'ah, that obedience to him is wajib. And the companions of Imam Hussain did not need to be reminded of this per se. Rather, just by looking at Imam Hussain, by being with Imam Hussain, by hearing the voice of Imam Hussain, they were reminded of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They were reminded of the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Thus, they did not need to be physically reminded by Imam Hussain. All they needed was to be in the presence of their Imam, to be reminded of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's blessings. Thus, the Imam is the paradigmatic manifestation of God's light and God's grace. And if we were to go back to the meaning of Ayam Allah as the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then in that case we could of course refer to the Nahj al-Balagha, where Amir al-Mu'mineen tells us, وَلَا يُسَوَّ بِهِمْ مَنْ جَرَّتْ عَلَيْهِمْ نِعْمَتَهُمْ عَلَيْهِ أَبَدًا. That the Imam says that the one who receives their ni'mah, meaning the ni'mah of Ali Muhammad, cannot be compared to Ali Muhammad. Meaning the mun'im cannot be compared to the ni'mah. The one who is the receiver of blessings cannot be compared to the one that gives out blessings. Here Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam describes Ali Muhammad as the ni'mah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And everyone else receives those blessings through Ali Muhammad. So in this case, of course, Imam Hussain is the embodiment, or could also be described as the embodiment or the personification of Ayam Allah. And this is precisely what Musa had to remind his people of regarding the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Lastly, these are signs for the one that is sabarun shukur. For the one that is sabar, meaning kathiru sabr, the person who has a lot of patience, a lot of forbearance and thankfulness. Why is this? That when a prophet or an imam comes to guide people, it will never be easy. When a prophet or an imam comes to take people into the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it will not be easy. They will experience many things. They will experience, first of all, the bala. They will experience tests and trials, or as Tabarasi says, mihna, a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And thus they are required not only to be sabir, but to be sabbar. That is, to have an abundant amount of forbearance. That if they do not have an abundant amount of forbearance and perseverance, they will not be able to stay firmly on the path of their sacred guide. And of course we see this in the case of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, that his companions and family on the day of Ashura were anything, or everything that it means, or rather they were the embodiment of being sabbar. And Imam Hussain himself, as I said, and I will emphasize again, was the existential emblem or the quintessential sabbar, that he did not even need to speak about being sabbar. But he himself was sabbar, and he was the embodiment of what it means to be sabbar. And the companions did not need to be reminded of this. All they needed to do was to witness the very breath of their Imam in order for them to be shorn up and strengthened as they stood with him during his final stand on the day of Ashura.
I think it's an excellent point.
Yeah.
It would be nice if you mention 3 examples of Musa's sabr, and then directly after 3 examples of Imam Hussein's sabr. Just
Okay.
link to that sabr, so that people can make so just choose, for example, 3, and sequentially right away link it to 3 incidents in the life of Imam Hussain.
Thinking of 3, the golden calf, 1,
She.
the sea, yes, 2. And the first one, the exit out of Egypt, when he killed the person and he had to run away.
Exactly, Imam Hussain leaving
So one-
from Medina to Mecca.
So his him being forced out of Egypt, right? When he had to help that person,
Imam
right?
Hussain forced out of Medina.
Out of Medina. And then 2 would be after the message, the incident of the golden calf, having to deal with a community or an ummah that violated Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's commandments, greatest commandments.
And
Imam
so
Hussain had to deal with that, with the general ummah at large, right? With the khiyana of the ummah, right? The
Exactly.
betrayal of the ummah. And then number 3, of course, is the Red Sea, of the Pharaoh following him and Allah parting the Red Sea and him delivering his community out of Israel.
Yeah.
And the third for Imam Hussain alayhi salam would be yeah.
إن معي ربي
Yeah.
الإمام حسين عليه السلام هون ما نزل بي أنه بعين الله.
Yeah.
If you can link those, it would be beautiful. So Bismillah.
I'll try my best. I didn't. Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. So on the point of Nabi Musa alayhi salam being commanded by Allah to remind Bani Israel that if they want to join him on this mission, they must have an abundant amount of forbearance, and they must be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
1 second, sorry. Just this camera is timed every 10 minutes to stop.
Okay.
So I'm just put it back. Excellent. Alhamdulillah. Bismillah. So you can.
Now, of course, there are examples in both the life of Nabiullah Musa and Imam Hussain alayhim salatu wasalam, where both of them manifested profound instances of forbearance. Of course, in the case of Prophet Musa, there was, of course, the case where he intervened to try to help someone that was being oppressed and had to actually kill someone, or someone died in that incident, and he was forced to leave Egypt. He was forced to run out of the district that was ruled by the Pharaoh at that time. And the second incident in the life of Prophet Moses, peace and blessings be upon him, is of course the golden calf. The incident of the cow that was worshipped by the children of Israel. That after all that work that he went through with the grace and help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide them to Allah, to guide them to the nur of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the light of Allah, he goes away for a certain amount of time, comes back, and they are already into idol worship again. And of course, the third one being the final stand or the climax of the story, where he is delivering the people of Israel out of Egypt, and the army of the Pharaoh is engulfed into the sea. Now, in the case of Imam Hussain, he was forced to leave Medina. He was forced to leave Medina under circumstances that were out of his control. Secondly, Imam Hussain alayhi salam was confronting the greatest khiyana and betrayal of the ummah. Right? That there were many people that claimed that they believed in him, that claimed that they loved him, but at the end of the day, they did not follow him. And they were not ready to sacrifice for him. And thirdly, of course, on the day of Ashura itself, On the day of that final battle, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was with the Imam, and all the Imam could remember was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala during his final moments, in the same way that as Moses went with the children of Israel, there was no wavering, there was no doubt that Allah was with them. As the Pharaoh pursued them, in the same way there was no doubt that and there was no doubt at all, of course, na'udhu billah, in the mind of Imam Hussain that Allah was with him. And likewise, there was no doubt in the minds and the hearts of the companions of Imam Hussain that Allah was with them during their final stand on the day of Ashura.
That was a very nice one.
Yeah.
If you can say how the companions of Moses questioned him, inna la mudra.
Yeah, okay.
Whereas the companions
didn't question the Imam. Yeah.
They were like, so you can put that.
Okay, that's a good one. Okay, let me mention that. Lastly, of course, when we are comparing the patience of the companions of Prophet Musa and the patience of the companions of Imam Hussein, we can certainly state that the companions of Musa, or the followers of Musa alayhi salam, constantly questioned him. They gave him grievances and difficulties all along the way. In the case of Imam Hussain, on that day, he had no grievances from anyone. History tells us, in fact, and this is not the history of the Shia, this is a history, the general universal history tells us that no one complained on the day of Ashura. No one for one moment questioned the judgment of their holy Imam on the day of Ashura. The second verse which I would like to discuss with regards to Imam Hussain, the connection between Imam Hussain and Prophet Musa, and how Imam Hussain is the warith, or the inheritor of Prophet Musa alayhi salam, is the verse which immediately follows the first one that I mentioned. These are all in the beginning of Surah Ibrahim, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, when Moses said to his people, remember the bounty of Allah upon you, when you were saved from Al Fir'aun. I'll have to do that again, sorry.
Yeah, no.
I didn't memorize the verse completely. The second element or aspect of comparison between Prophet Musa and Imam al-Hussein alayhim as-salam is in the next verse in Surah Ibrahim. These are all found in the early verses of Surah Ibrahim, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِذْ قَالَ مُوسَى لِقَوْمِهِ اذْكُرُوا نِعْمَةُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكُمْ. That when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells Moses to remind them about the blessings of, or to tell the people of Israel to remember and recall the blessings of Allah. Why? Because there was a time where they were enslaved under Al Fir'aun. Right? What did Al Fir'aun do to them? يُذَبِّحُونَ أَبْنَاءَكُمْ. That he slaughtered their children and left their women alive. And even before that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that Al Fir'aun tortured them, put them through an immense amount of torture and suffering. Right? And Nabi Allah Musa is told to remind the people of Israel that they were saved from this. Now today, do not be ungrateful. I was sent to you and I saved you and delivered you from the shackles and the torture of Al Fir'aun, which means here that it was not only one Pharaoh, there were many. Now of course this can be related to Imam Hussain, and I will get to that in just a moment. But let us finish the verse. Of course I am just paraphrasing the verse here, but the verse ends very importantly by saying, فِي ذَلِكُمْ بَلَاءٌ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ عَظِيمٌ. That this is a bala, or a test from your great Lord. That everything that the children of Israel went through, that Bani Israel went through, was a bala from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was a test from Allah to see how faithful they were. To see if through the difficult times, will they forget Allah or will they remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there are a couple of points that need to be mentioned here very briefly. First of all, it is clear that Musa, peace and blessings be upon him, had a great struggle. They were struggling. Yes?
You can say that again because you looked at me.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm not used to these things. Okay. There are a couple of points to be mentioned at the outset here. First of all, Musa, peace and blessings be upon him, had a great struggle. They were not struggling against a legacy of one pharaoh, but Ala Fir'aun. There was an entire family that was in the habit of killing, maiming, and torturing those who believe in the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which at this time was Bani Israel. Musa brought them out of Egypt in what is known as the Exodus. And remember, these years were years of hardship. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that it was a test from God. And if we refer again to the verse before, in order to withstand this test, they are required to be, or the person is required to be sabbar. The person is required to have an abundance amount of patience in order to pass the test that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has bestowed upon them. Imam Hussain and the Musibah of Karbala can certainly be related to this verse. Insofar as, first of all, again, I should mention that Imam Hussain did not need to remind his companions of Allah's blessings. He did not even ever need to remind them that they must be patient, because they never questioned the judgment of their Imam. There was never a need on the day of Ashura for the Imam to worry, na'udhu billah, about the wafa and the loyalty and the commitment of his companions. This is an important difference between Imam Hussain and Prophet Musa alayhi salam. Secondly, Imam Hussein's own children were killed. Right, as the verse says, that Ala Fir'aun killed your children, abna'akum. This was not something that Imam Hussain had to worry about with regards to the children of his companions, to the children of his friends. Rather, it was his own children that were killed. He had to, again, become, not had to, because the Imam does not need to become anything, because he doesn't need to instill effort to become that, but the Imam rose to the occasion in such a way that he was the quintessential emblem of what it means to be patient in the face of suffering, to be patient in the face of the loss of his own children. That in the case here, Nabi Musa is reminding Bani Israel that your children were killed. Here, Imam Hussein's own children were killed. And also in this case, the women of Imam Hussain and the companions of Imam Hussain were kept alive, as the verse mentions in Surah Ibrahim. Sorry. I have something stuck in my throat. Yeah, my throat's getting dry. Okay, I'm almost done though. I just have two more lines. Two more lines and we're done. Okay. Thus, okay.
Because anyways,
sure. You know, and
body language is actually good.
Yeah. We're here. It's kind of just good thing I have you. Otherwise, you know. Yeah. Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thus, another point of comparison, of course, is that the children of Imam Hussain were not spared, nor were the children of the companions of Imam Hussain alayhi salatu wasalam. And in this case, as I mentioned, Nabi Musa had to remind the children of Israel that they had lost their children, that their children were killed. Where here Imam Hussein's own children were killed. This again shows not only how he is a warith of Musa, peace and blessings be upon him, but he had to sacrifice more than Prophet Moses had to sacrifice. Right? And thus he's the emblematic or quintessential sabbar, as I've already mentioned earlier, but I think this point is of immeasurable importance to emphasize. And as the verse ends, and as the verse ends, this or that is for you a test from your great Lord. Bala'un min rabbikum azim. Now naturally, again, this is Prophet Musa speaking to the children of Israel. Not that Prophet Musa did not go through bala himself, as we already discussed. He went through many tests by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we cannot even begin to compare what Imam Hussain went through and what Prophet Musa alayhi salam went through. Not to say that Nabi Musa is that we're putting down Nabi Musa. Not at all. Not at all. But this is the gradation in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's plan for humanity. And that's why Imam Hussain is known as Sayyid al-Shuhada, as the prince or the chief of all martyrs, because he experienced the greatest bala. That through the loss of his own children, through the loss of his companions, through him having to witness on the day of Ashura the desecration of his tents, to witness as he laid on the ground, as we are told in Ziyarat al-Muqaddasa from our 12th Imam, that as the Imam laid on the ground, his eyes twitched towards the tents. It twitched towards the tents. Why? Because at this moment he was disabled. At this moment his body was riddled with arrows. Yani huwa kal kunfuth, as the traditions tell us. He was like a porcupine. He could not move. The Imam was disabled at this moment, but his eyes and head could twitch towards the tent, and he had to witness what was happening to his women. And thus he is Sayyid al-Shuhada. And no one's bala could be compared to Imam Hussain alayhi salam. That yes, the children of Israel, Bani Israel, endured bala. But no one experienced bala like Imam Hussain, insofar as not only did he have to witness the successful struggles, of course, of his companions, but he himself was the object of this bala. And of course, the Imam alayhi salam not only passed that bala, but he's the embodiment of what it means to be sabbar. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد. This one piece that I want to record and then I will edit.
Okay, yes.
So when you talk about Musa alayhi salam, ذكرهم بأيام الله, just to mention that how Imam Hussain alayhi salam did comprehensive speeches.
Yes.
In Medina, in Mecca specifically, and then on the road, and then on the day of Karbala 3 times. He actually reminded them of the Prophet and the whole heritage, so that we can link it back.
Okay, sure. But I don't have to start again, do I?
No, just talk about
this. Okay, sure.
I can edit it easily.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. And of course, most importantly, this reminder was for the people that were questioning his judgment as well. Especially in Mecca, for example, Abdullah ibn Abbas and others who are coming and questioning the Imam's judgment because they never joined the Imam in Karbala, right? Including Muhammad ibn Hanafiya as well, never joined the Imam. Now, while the companions and the loyal followers of Imam Hussain did not require to be reminded of the ayam of Allah, the Imam nevertheless, throughout the journey and throughout his speeches from Medina to Karbala, reminded the people of Allah's blessing and the legacy of the Prophet and the legacy of Allah's grace and power. And most importantly, this reminder was for those that questioned the Imam's judgment. And there were those among the prominent Muslims who approached the Imam in Mecca and Medina to question his judgment regarding him going to Karbala, or rather the situation of Karbala had not come up yet, but him going to Kufa. And the Imam had to remind them of the ayam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this regard.